The next topic is content security in federated media cloud workflows, presented by Ben Schofield. And Ben is a digital media consultant focused on media logistics and metadata and content security. He is currently implementing end-to-end media featured cloud workflows and is product lead for the Trusted Partner Network, the global industry-wide film and television content protection initiative for major studios. Ben is closely involved in the IMF standards work streams at the DPP and unique IDs for content. That's the EIDR. Ben ran the Red Bee Media team supporting the rapid growth of BBC iPlayer from launch and helped major broadcasters and studios set up efficient digital content distribution to new platforms. Other projects included restarting Project Dovetail VOD audience, measurement for BARB, B-A-R-B, launching the BFI player for the British Film Institute, and technology due diligence buy sell side for private equity and post-production, and ad distribution and fintech, So with that, Ben, welcome, and take it away, please.
Yeah, and I guess there's a lesson for me in writing a shorter bio. And I guess it's also the time of day when everyone's got very low blood sugar. So I think this is going to be a little less technical, somewhat light relief. It's talking about open control frameworks in the media entertainment and how Sebastian's been helping with how I do this mapping exercise. So the Content Delivery and Security Organization is it's really a consortium of all the major vendors in the media supply chain, and trying to make sure that content, very valuable content, is protected as it moves from the production set through to the consumer. And I think about 5 years ago, there was an initiative put together by the Motion Picture Association of America, the MPA, and the CDSA that said, instead of having multiple different audits going on if you're a vendor in the supply chain, you might have to do an audit for Fox, one for Disney, one for HBO, to try and make that a common control set and a single audit, which is much more efficient, and that would reduce the cost for the vendor. So that really was quite a successful program. It's been rolled out, and now if you want to do business with those studios, you have to have this trusted partner assurance that they've been through an audit process. But in the meantime, as a lot of work went into that original kind of predominantly site security, audience and revenues are moving very fast online, and there's been a big shift to not just digital production, but also digital distribution. So to following that audience. And in latter years, that's really meant a real focus on cloud-based migration. And so when you look at those security controls that were really written around those physical sites, they were no longer really appropriate. Well, still appropriate for the traditional old school organizations, but if you're building an edit suite where you're doing video editing, and that's going to be pretty well fixed in its location and its role for 3 years, then a yearly audit or a quarterly review on network is fine. But when you start doing that in the cloud, then you can no longer rely on that once a year shot. So I guess the way I look at the media supply chain is there's an evolution, and at one end you've got very basic kind of cyber essentials guidance stuff. Really, the media supply chain isn't yet regulated, so it's not like you go to jail if you get it wrong, so as with some of the regulation industries. But when you look at something like GDPR or CCPA in California, there are going to be some significant financial penalties if you misuse customer information, personal information, and that is something that all the major studios are now, having seen the success of Netflix and Amazon, they're all racing to create their own direct consumer VOD offerings. So up this evolutionary curve, really what you want to make sure is your entire supply chain is moving up that curve. So in the UK, there's a self-certified checklist against some 40 controls. And obviously that's a great start, but really there is no external audit, no external check. So for the US studios, they insist on this professional audit, and then once you've got an audit report, that can be shared across their membership. And then you look at people like Netflix, who are pushing the envelope, as always, and they're moving to a full, removing the perimeter and doing that zero trust type approach. So when I first kind of looked at that MPA control set, it was 100 pages of PDF and fairly dense, tight, table, and it's very difficult to assimilate 400 odd controls in one place. So this is my diagram that breaks it down, and you can see that when you're going to the original site security, you have obviously people and processes. You have a fence going around the facility and security guards. You've got a reception area, and then if you come through reception, get into the office, and you've got an isolated content network where content would come in and then content production would go on. So if you were in an old school physical DVD replicator, the security van would turn up, you'd pull out the discs, and you'd then burn your masters, and it would go back out on the truck. When you go to digital side of the house, there are parallels here. You've still got that firewall as your perimeter fence, and the switch that distributes you into your DMZ or into the kind of the public facing side of the network. So there are some good parallels. When you move to cloud, a lot of that infrastructure gets abstracted up into the network, up into the cloud. But there will always be people, there will always be processes, and there will always be some sort of physical location where this is taking place. And this has only been exacerbated in recent months with COVID, where that Wi-Fi network is actually your home Wi-Fi network. So you've got fully distributed production. But really, the big change that comes with cloud is, as I mentioned, about the frequency of change. What's great about cloud is you can spin up 1,000 servers or shut down 1,000 servers. You're only one line of JSON away from disaster in your software release. So the TPN put together a new initiative that said let's write some controls that deal with this new situation to deal with software. And the way it was originally conceived was, well, you have applications and you have cloud platforms, and that sounds fine. But if you look at the difference between these, most of the applications in the media supply chain are small software as a service vendors who may have 30, 50 people if you're lucky, and CTO has got root access. They're small, very tight organizations. You look at cloud platforms, they're behemoth. They're incredibly physically secure. They're horizontal. They deal with many different industries and standards. They've got a very high level of security, but there is a shared responsibility both with the application vendors and with the integration partners as to how you make sure you keep that secure. So it's not just one application typically. There are multiple applications. There's integration code, and then finally you've got infrastructure as code that's building your configuration, standing up your configuration on the cloud platform. So that's quite a big attack surface, and it's distributed across multiple different vendors. And the way that the really big guys deal with this, and there's great talk from Andy Troutman 2 years ago at reInvent in Vegas that said, where he talks about how Amazon deal with this, and they're pretty flexible about what technologies you choose down at the 2 pizza team level. The small teams can really do what they like, but everything they produce has to go through this release pipeline. And this actually, when Andy scrolled it on the screen, it went 7 pages to the right. So every change in Amazon is treated like it's trying to bring down the Bezos empire. If you look at Netflix, here's a good example of their microservices architecture, but this was in 2014. So my guess is it's only got worse. And there are only a few organizations that have this level of engineering complexity and this degree of competence in how they handle security. When you shift to cloud, it's all about software, but it's also about the economics. What's driving that is this shift from CapEx to OpEx, that flexibility. And you'll find that there are very few businesses in the media industry that can have a stable kind of throughput. Most of them are go up and down. There'll be a production that spins up for 3 months and shuts down. The distribution business is slightly more kind of stable, but having that capacity to go up and down is very important. I think the other big thing is that when you look at media objects, they're very heavy. They're big objects, and traditionally, cloud has been viewed as not the right place, because every time you move stuff out of the cloud, you get charged, and it's slow to move it out of the cloud. But there's a new approach taking place now, which is to say, leave the heavy objects, leave the original objects back in the cloud in the S3 or in the Azure store, and take the tools and the skills and run them next to the work. But one of the other big things about the shift to cloud is the frequency of audits, as I've mentioned, which is, you no longer rely on having an annual audit where people scurry around, get ready for the audit, do the audit, and then stop thinking about it. Back to what the previous speaker was saying, you need to make sure you've got this continuous checking on the culture on everything you release. So really the initiative was trying to extend this original program and release a new custom control set. When you look at the supply chain, it's very varied. So you've got, in the Walt Disney Company, you've got something like 3,000 different vendors. NBCU would be probably 1,600 vendors. BBC Studios, maybe 500-600 vendors. And you are dependent on the weakest link in that supply chain. If you think about the HBO Game of Thrones leak, what happened was there was a guy in India who was being paid a few bucks an hour. His girlfriend was in the edit suite and took a picture of the content on their mobile phone. So, sometimes this is not a sophisticated hack. This is something that's is much more operationally driven. But how do you make sure that everyone in the company has the same approach? And if you look at Disney as an example, which is one of the biggest of the media and entertainment giants, they've got 40,000 people outside of the parks business, 40,000 people in the media and entertainment space, and they've got about 40 dedicated security people, which is a big team. That's 1 in 1,000. So going back to that supply chain, if most of the companies in your supply chain are less than 100 men strong, then you might be lucky to get 1 or 2 people who care about security. And really, the change that needs to happen is make security a vital topic for the executive. So, typically a sales guy will want to just tick all the checklist items and say, "Yep, we're approved, and now we can carry on doing business." And if you have to go through hell once a year to get the audit, that's fine, but it's a cost of doing business. And it's changing that around to make sure that this is something that happens all the time, that this is something that's embedded. So, where I'd landed was I inherited the original kind of 400 controls, maybe another 700 custom controls. And when I started trying to wrestle with this, I had the age-old problem, which is you get 10 security experts in a room and 11 opinions. So the cost and the time taken to write and then agree the specifics of those detailed controls was very taxing. And you need that level of granular detail if you're actually doing implementation or audit. You definitely don't need it if you're sitting in the exec suite. So we had a bit of an epiphany that said, instead of trying to originate a new set of controls that all are mapped out to those NIST, ISO, CSA controls, why not flip it around and say, if we can take the controls from the industry standards and not do any origination, we can really reduce the amount of effort to maintain them. Now, there'll always be some custom overlap, but when you actually look at when you read those controls and you start reading them, and after 4 months of reading 2,500 lines of controls in a spreadsheet, you kind of start going a bit snowblind. But you can see they are very much clustered together. I think the other thing to say is that the cloud platforms in this move to cloud also have a lot of best practice and design patterns that are available. So taking some of the specific detail out of those controls and moving into that best practice is a much better place for it to be. But the real killer in supply chain is making sure that the documentation is delivered in a usable format that is can be read by an operations or an executive person. And again, this is a very technical audience. This is a very security-focused audience, but it's making sure that you've got something that isn't a 100-page PDF, which is full of jargon, but it's something that they recognize as part of the business. And if their customers are telling them, it will make it easier for them to apply it. Finally, when if you're doing high frequency of audit, what you can't do is have an auditor on tap, because they're expensive. The typical cost of an audit for a 3-day audit is $5,000, $6,000, $10,000. So how do you make sure that people can check their own stuff, and that as they're going through, they have their own dashboard where they're checking on what's going on. So the things that an auditor would normally check, they can check themselves. And back to the last point, really security is about people, not about technology. So it's how you get these skills, how do you make it important to the exec, and then allow people to start to do this. So the approach we took was to amalgamate all these controls together into a monster spreadsheet, break into work streams and try and get people to do that bottom-up mapping, and also do some top-down mapping. And that was the idea, is there to create a reduced set, which is the one that's applicable to the business, and to also engage with standards groups. So I spoke to Sebastian and talked to him about SAMM, and SAMM absolutely applies in the for me to the if you guess for the training aspect and your how you look at your maturity. But he pointed me towards ASVS as a control set, which is used for verification, but it's much more granular, detailed control set that fits in with software development. And alongside that, to actually engage with those major platforms to try and drag out those secure config guidelines and try and amalgamate these in one place, so that people can, there's a kind of a degree of equivalence, not just across the controls, but in terms of the tooling, depending on what you need to pick. So we've gone down now from 2,500 rows to about 1,300. That needs to move down further. So probably 50 of those high-level controls, and I would say 500 max of the detail controls, hopefully less than that, with most of the detail control being devolved into a best practice. And also giving people a fast start. Most people in the media supply chain have to have a business continuity plan. They have to have a cybersecurity incident plan and a security incident team to be able to write the cybersecurity insurance policy. But those tend to be, static documents. Anyone doing software development may well be using a tool like a Jira or Confluence or GitHub to make sure that everything is up to date. And for me, a lot of the problem around audit is that having a single version of the truth, having a documentation set easy to use. So the idea here is to create that set so that people can really accelerate deployment. Another advantage with Media Entertainment is they have an ISAC, which is basically publishing threats all the time. So this is one of the accepted ISACs in the US. And it means you can then tie that together with the risk register and again draw from some of those cloud guidelines in terms of certification and the skills development stuff that's available to establish that culture. So where have we ended up? And apologies, this is a bit of an eye strain chart, so hopefully you can get the shape of it. But in terms of taking those top level controls, what I've done is tried to group them together. So taking the control sets from CSA and from CIS and from OWASP ASVS and say, how do they map to the things that people do in business? Now, it's interesting when you look at the Cloud Security Alliance, the CCM 3.01 control set. There are 4 controls that relate to software development, and to my mind, that's not enough to cover it. So I'd say the CSA CCM is very strong on some of the people and process pieces, but not so strong on application development. Again, looking at the patterns here, you can see from the graph that CIS is very good at implementation of local configuration. And as we developed this, we found that just relying on CSA, which is very much for pure cloud platform, wasn't really enough for what was needed if you're going to be doing a hybrid model or on-prem. So just going around this block, you can see we've got the things the executives should care about, which is the people policies, the supply chain, their third-party contracts, their policy documents, a high-level policy, and their risk register. The security team obviously needs to track incidents and continuity and also track audit. And then if you go down from the operations side, you've got your access control. You've really got your ideas of roles and responsibilities. And in this case for media, the data is the media assets themselves. Plus you've got locations. And what that leaves then is and I've broken down, just taking a nominal breakdown here of kind of business logic, core, and services for ASVS. And then for the CIS infrastructure, I've broken that down to configuration and crypto. So that is quite a high level, broad brush. You could not do a security audit based on this, but it's more about orientating this to be palatable for the businesses so that they can start working their way into the detail. So the approach we've got is to say, first of all, let's select a group of standards, and this may vary. We started off just with MPA, OWASP, and CSA, and we added in CIS for that hybrid model. And what we're hoping to be able to do is create a set of 5 pillars that say, here's location, here's people and process, cloud platform, infrastructure and configuration, development lifecycle. And if we can then, from those standards, draw what we think is the most appropriate standards and map the equivalent standards, it means we can publish a mapping of those controls. But what it removes is the need for us to do any development of new controls. Alongside that, we've got your secure config guidelines. There's best practices. Your media entertainment. There's a media entertainment lens for AWS. There are tools like Prowler, and we can publish those in a toolbox. And for each of the platforms, depending on which you choose, you should be able to then have that complete set. What we'd expect to do is create a basic kind of template, and probably starting off with Jira Conference, but the Jira is out at the moment. And then depending on which type of service you're offering, those controls will apply. And then what you'd expect people to do is have a rough template for a procedure which would satisfy the control. And then people will update that and amend that for their own purposes. And in many of these security controls, they expect to have an operations and design guide available. They expect it to be available for people to be able to use. So, sorry, I just lost my thread there. Sorry, inbound Slack call knocked me off track. Just bear with me a second. Yeah, so the other piece here is updates. So obviously we've got, as changes happen to the controls, we want to map those through automatically so you don't have the burden of change. And in talking to the OWASP guys, there's a YAML document that we could bring through, and then we can automate the updates of those controls. Similarly, from the ISAC, we can take the threat model, and that will update directly a risk register. And we'd expect those updates, as new vulnerabilities emerge, for those to feed through the controls and into the best practice. And then the final bit, I guess, is the people side, which is how you make sure that you've got certified individuals, that you've got a training register, and you can check on their progress, that they've actually read changes to these documents. So, I realize I'm here on OWASP Day, and I've talked a lot about media entertainment, not a lot about OWASP. So for me, this is where SAMM really lives. Across this space, it says assessing what your skills and your maturity is, looking at the best practice, the secure guidelines. And I originally started to try and break SAMM down into a control set. And I think ASVS is probably a better target for that. But the two do tie together very well to be able to help us in this effort. We've created this massive control set, which we're going to then review and publish and strip down. But hopefully, once it's mapping down, our effort is massively reduced. So going back to those original aims that we were looking for, I think what we've been able to do is include cloud and the new cloud workflows in this content security metaphor. We've managed to switch from having a very high maintenance and very hotly debated custom set of controls for media entertainment to a common control set, including OWASP. Hopefully, we can then have that efficient operation, and we've got a a much higher frequency of assurance because you are mapping to the current threats. And we've got we're giving the key the customer, I guess, is the content studios who are paying for all this in one way or another, with greater certainty that when they give their valuable content to one of the vendors, that they're going to treat it properly. And I think we're going to make it easier for security for those vendors to engage. Now, obviously, part of that, there's carrot and stick. You have to make sure that they're told they won't get the contracts unless they do conform, and that's largely happening. But you also need to help them and establish that culture. And the other interesting point here is everyone's heard of the shortage of cybersecurity talent. I think what we're able to do here is probably attract a wide range of auditors who've come maybe from these different control sets, from these different religions, and can apply this now in the media and entertainment sector. So hopefully that leaves me with a couple of minutes for questions. I realize this hasn't been a very technical talk, but it's an insight into an end-to-end supply chain.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. No questions yet in the queue, but since I have access to the microphone, I'm going to take advantage of that. And I have two questions, if I may. And the first one may seem very unrelated, but it's actually a kind of a lead in to the second question. So my first question is as follows. The recording industry, the audio recording industry, seemed late in responding to the move to digital. And from my observation, and I have zero inside knowledge or expertise here, but from my observation, it seems like the film recording industry also was a little bit slow, perhaps not as slow to move from analog to digital. Can you speak to that? And then I have a follow-on question.
Yeah, so I think I mentioned it briefly, but if you look at the quality of what you're getting off the file size coming off these Red and ARRI cameras, it's absolutely massive, and you've got a huge amount of information, and people are very much used to taking that incredibly high quality content, putting it on a very high powered set of kit on a short network in a very localized sense in LA, and then doing some very esoteric edits or doing layback of, and they're very much focused on the quality and the audio. Now, if you think about that being played out at the other end, it may well be by the time you watch it on your mobile phone or you look at a trailer on YouTube, you're many changes of quality away from that. But I think there's been what's changed now is previously all those revenues were protected in different windows. So you have the studios doing the cinema release, and then a TV release and a home entertainment release. So all those different windows are now collapsing down, and I think the studios are realizing you have a single digital production chain, and then you try and send that content out to find where the audience is, wherever they are, and monetize that in different ways. So I think that's a real incentive, is that there's being a wholesale shift to digital technology. Although there are a few people talking about the magic of film and the quality of film and how you actually need to have all these wet processes, by and large, that's moved on. The quality is now at a point where the human eye can't distinguish between the digital and the cinema.
Thanks, Ben. So related to this then is, as a software developer, when I create secure systems, I get a benefit in that. First of all, like the film industry here, I'm protecting my intellectual property, but I get an indirect benefit in that I'm focused on helping my customer, which then ideally will increase my reputation and increase my sales. So I get a benefit back. In other words, the IP focus, securing that IP, is almost secondary to me focusing on the security of my systems in the context of my customer. You sort of answered here in your conclusions and talk about the supply chain, but how does the industry view this? Do they view this almost exclusively, the security aspect on protecting their own property, or is there some also a focus on the end users in this, other than perhaps leakage of an episode or something like that? But is there any focus on the customer?
Yeah, I'll tell you what's interesting. I mean, I do a lot of work with movie labs, and they did an effort that looked at streaming, and people pirating content. And what was the actual impact of that piracy on content consumption? And although there are some territories where it absolutely kills all the audience, especially with windowing. I think there's a mixed bag of, if you get a leak and that increases interest in content, that's great, but not if the leak goes to your competitors and allows them to bring out a parallel type of film. So I think the intellectual property and protecting it is absolutely vital. There's so much money spent. There's such high risk going into these things. But I think what's interesting, and I alluded to this earlier, is that studios who were previously only really concerned about their creating a catalog of content and then maximizing the return from it, but doing that through contracts, are now having to reach directly to those consumers. They've seen the rise of Netflix. We're talking directly to a consumer, and they realize they've got to have that approach. And that's not a set of skills that the studios have been doing since the 1940s. They've been basically offloading that hard work to global distribution chains and to third parties. And I think bringing that in-house and talking directly to the consumer means they now have to deal with PII.
Okay, and two quick questions with a quick response, hopefully, from our audience here. Have you seen cases where vendors are penalized for security vulnerabilities introduced due to products, tools, or code insertion from their side, or some trend where this is included as part of the MSA?
100%. So, if you look at the leaders in this industry who have the most robust systems, they will select one vendor over another because their security doesn't come up to the standards. So, you'll find that people are not getting contracts because their security isn't up to snuff. And when there's a breach, one of the duties that they have to do in their contracts is report that immediately to the studios. And then a SWAT team will descend on that vendor and work out what went wrong and if it's fixable or if not. So I think there are penalties, there are financial penalties, there's lack of business initially, and then there's so what we're trying to do is kind of grease those wheels and make it more frictionless, so that security is not seen as a cost, but it's seen as intrinsic to your delivery effort.
Okay, and just quick, few seconds left. Are there any standards or specifications recommended to go through while you review and audit vendor provided security assessment reports?
So I think I've talked about this mapping effort, and what we're trying to is move away from detailed creation of detailed pieces, and to actually actually create a new way of approaching security, which is with these map standards. So I think the whole effort. I mean, if you go and look at the MPA or the TPN, you'll find the best practice there. So these things are available in the public domain. But what we're trying to do here is instead of that being implicitly linked to external standards, to make it explicitly linked.
Thank you. Appreciate it, Ben.